Good morning. Welcome to worship with First Presbyterian Church. This is our fifth Sunday of opening our doors, and it is so good to see your eyes. We continue to strive to be welcoming and hospitable, even in the midst of these times where we still need to have some distance for safety. Every month, we invite you to give of your treasure to various organizations that support the ministries and the witnesses of Jesus Christ. This month, you are being encouraged to give to the Pakistan Education Project that is sponsored by the Presbyterian Church in Pakistan. And this is a place where we have helped there to be schools that are accessible to all, whatever their faith is. This is one of the rare places in Pakistan where people of Islamic and Christian faith, children, are learning together. So we encourage you to give generously to this witness to world peace. Also, we've made the difficult decision that about every fourth or fifth Sunday, we will not be live. We will only be online, so we encourage you to keep your ears and eyes open for when that happens. This month, it happens to fall on Halloween, so you can be at home, watch the streaming, get your costumes ready, things like that. This is just to kind of have us catch a holy breath, a holy pause. It is a labor-intensive experience to actually open our doors, so we want to be mindful and careful of all of our volunteers. This week, you should be receiving a delightful letter that is chock full of the things that we have continued to do during the pandemic, and also an encouragement to consider how you will continue to give your time, your treasure in the next year. So I think you will find it a very inspirational mailing. We do send out a weekly email blast that has what is going on in our congregation. It also includes a summary of what will be happening on Sunday morning. So if you've not yet signed up for that, please email the church. During this time, we are especially focusing on mystics. Mystics are those who have been a part of our church tradition and history. While they value the intellect, and many of them are scholars, and the knowledge of God, they have particular gifts to open to the experience of God, perhaps through visions or nature or art or other ways that in the past the traditional church was not particularly open to. The other thing about mystics is they have been able to rest in the mystery and the unknown, not only of life, but also of God. So this particular Sunday, you'll be learning more about Hildegard of Bingen. Can you guess what country she was from? Germany. Bingen. So our call to worship she was also a musician, and so our call to worship this morning, we're going to weave in an arrangement of a chant that she actually wrote that is sung in Latin, but I trust that you will still be able to capture the beauty that she expresses in her love for God, for nature, and for all of humanity. Let us worship God.
Saint Hildegard of Bingen wrote, "Humanity, take a good look at yourself. Inside, you've got heaven and earth and all of creation. You're a world. Everything is hidden in you. Like billowing clouds, like the incessant gurgle of the brook, the longing of the spirit can never be stilled."
Into
Humankind, full of all creative possibilities, is God's work. Humankind alone is called to assist God. Humankind is called to co-create. With nature's help, humankind can set into creation all that is necessary and life-sustaining. Part of the terror is to take back our own listening, to use our own voice, to see our own light. All living creatures are sparks from the radiation of God's brilliance, emerging from God like the rays of the sun. I welcome all the creatures of the world with grace.
Well, St. Hildegard von, I've heard a German pronounce it Bingen. Some, Bingham? Okay. I heard a German on a clip I watched, so who knows? Bingham. I'm going to take Anne's word for it. It's quite a personality, quite a person, so much to learn, so much that I cannot catch you up on all of it in the 12 to 15 minutes that I need to keep myself within today. So I do recommend a more recent documentary that's only 65 minutes long called Unruly Mystics, and it's only $2.99 that you can rent via Vimeo, actually who we stream through, and it's quite a well-done documentary on her life, including people like Matthew Fox and others who speak about her impact that continues today. I do like a lot of her quotes. My favorite is that a dog is good for, I'm going to update the language, a person's soul. A dog is good for a person's soul. So all you cat people, I'm sorry. Hildegard was a dog person. I'm going to read briefly from 1 Corinthians chapter 1, 25 through 31. For God's foolishness is wiser than human wisdom, and God's weakness is stronger than human strength. Consider your own call, brothers and sisters. Not many of you were wise by human standards. Not many were powerful. Not many were of noble birth. But God chose what is foolish in the world to shame the wise. God chose what is weak in the world to shame the strong. God chose what is low and despised in the world, things that are not, to reduce to nothing things that are, so that no one might boast in the presence of God. God is the source of your life in Christ Jesus, who became for us wisdom from God and righteousness and sanctification and redemption, in order that, as it is written, let one who boasts, boast in the Lord. Well, she was born in 1098, and she died September 17th, 1179. Her parents were of free, lower nobility, and yet she was described as sickly as a young child, although the very nature of that sickness was not clear. But she did live a relatively long life. But she did record that she saw visions as early as 6 years old or earlier. She describes these visions this way. From my early childhood, before my bones, nerves, and veins were fully strengthened, I have always seen this vision in my soul, even to the present time when I am more than 70 years old. In this vision, my soul, as God would have it, rises up high into the vault of heaven and into the changing sky and spreads itself out among different peoples. Although they are far away from me in distant lands and places, and because I see them this way in my soul, I observe them in accord with the shifting of clouds and other created things. I do not hear them with my outward ears, nor do I perceive them by the thoughts of my own heart or by any combination of my 5 senses, but in my soul alone, while my outward eyes are open. So I have never fallen prey to ecstasy in the visions, but I see them wide awake day and night, and I am constantly fettered by sickness and often in the grip of pain so intense that it threatens to kill me, but God has sustained me until now. The light which I see thus is not spatial, but it is far, far brighter than a cloud which carries the sun. I can measure neither height nor length nor breadth in it, and I call it the reflection of the living light. And as the sun, the moon, and the stars appear in water, so writings, sermons, virtues, and certain human actions take form for me and gleam. I love that. As she calls this the reflection of the living light. And just as we see stars and sun and moon maybe in a clear pool of water, so too she relates writings and words and maybe even her music as that sign, that reflection of that living light. Hildegard was entered into a monastery or convent, it kind of combined early. She felt the visions that these visions she had. And again, this wasn't like a vision of a person or a voice as she describes. It was just a sense of this great light and she's written about how it connects and infuses all of creation. And so it was a much more abstract vision rather than some visions you may hear others describe as a voice or a person appearing to them. Very much not like the biblical vision of a angel appearing to people, but more of a light, a sense that she knew, not with her senses, but with her soul. Well, nearly 1,000 years later, in 2012, Hildegard was sainted and named Doctor of the Church, giving her writings equal authority to many in the church, including Thomas of Aquinas. Quite a level in the Roman Catholic Church to be named at, and quite an accomplishment and quite a subject of much writing, and because of how few women have been named to this level of the church and veneration. The most surprising thing about Hildegard is that she was actually as popular as she was in her own day. And she was. Because patriarchy had won out in the Roman Catholic Church. And women's voices were often silenced and suppressed. And often pushed to the sidelines or told to be silent. Hildegard had some good allies that helped her to continue to write and speak, and her mentor, Jutta, J-U-T-T-A, is that right? Jutta in German, was also entered into the convent early age, and she was a much more strict rule follower of the rule of Saint Benedict. And so Hildegard was mentored by her. But when she died, Jutta died, Hildegard was named as the Mother Superior, the one leading, the magistrate, as it was called then, of the convent. And so she opened up a bit. And maybe it was a little bit of a rebellion of Jutta's strict observance of the rule. And so she began to write and speak more. Even though she said she's held these things all her life, she finally able to write and speak and write songs. And unfortunately, musical scholars have done their best to match her words to what the music of the time was, but really how they were sung, according to musical scholars, was not preserved. And so what we have, but she would write in Latin because that was what was expected, but she also was popular because she wrote in her vernacular. And people, everyday people, could read and hear her words and her music and understand the words that she was singing. So she did both. Music was often used, and maybe one reason why she wrote in songs, and even there's some historical record in her writings that this was so, because it was more acceptable that she could write these words out in music and they could be sung rather than her preaching or teaching to the masses. And so music, and that's been used a great deal by those who were suppressed otherwise, to communicate the truths and the things that they felt compelled to preach and say in their lives. And so we had this rich volume of music, and a lot of her theology comes from her music because that was preserved because it was more acceptable. And so we have a good record from her as well. Music was a way to communicate for those who are on the margins, who others tried to control. Just briefly, Hildegard was, by some scholars' estimations or theses, and I'm not going to use the words of today, so I'm going to use a word called neurodivergent. That is, that she thought differently, and maybe her brain was wired differently. And you could say that's the case for her for sure, just because she stood out so differently and brought such a new perspective. Thought differently than the majority. She was somewhat literal when she talked about this idea of the greening of the world and the greening of theology. She would talk about the greening of things. It was about nature and the greening of the world, and she was born and lived, died just a few years before St. Francis was born. So she was one who brought in this idea of all creation was infused with divine light, and this light, a reflection of this divine light. And she was so literal about that, she started dressing in all green and would wear green all of the time. She wrote, "Good people, most royal greening verdancy, rooted in the sun, you shine with radiant light." She observed nature and understood things before people even knew what they were. She was one of the first to suggest boiling water before drinking it, before we had any inkling of microbes and little things in water that made us sick and killed us and were killed when they were boiled. She was a scientist and is still considered a scientist by Germans, a patron saint of science, and for them, and also named a scientist by the church, or a mother of natural science or the natural world. So she definitely had a different way of approaching the world, a different way of perceiving the reality of the world and of the reality or the mystery beyond what we see and hear with our five senses. Now, some like to lump that all together these days, that those who think differently, who are neurodivergent, all together into one diagnosis so that they can contend it may be a disorder and less preferable than the way the majority thinks or perceives the world. But the reality is that not all those who may be on the spectrum are disabled, but they're only rejected and bullied by the majority. Women know a thing or two about being rejected and bullied just for who they are. And add thinking differently and being neurodivergent, and you have a double whammy. So Hildegard had a bit of a double whammy, and maybe why, being such a different child at such a young age, her parents chose to put her in basically the way you could institutionalize, to put in a convent or a monastery, because she might have frightened people by the way she was and the way that she did not fit into the molds of the majority. And now, I'm not saying that her parents putting her in there bullied her, but the nature of society and the nature of what happens to people like Hildegard, being bullied and being pushed out of society is a form of bullying. But it is in the margins and the people in the margins that we have always had the voices that have helped us understand the mystery beyond. It has always been those on the margins who have opened up some new truth and were a light to the world. Even Jesus was on the margins, pushed out, and not accepted by those, and did not do things the conventional way, approached things in a very different way and communicated in a very different way, and questioned the things that the majority took for granted or took as the reality or the truth, and challenged people. And yet, isn't it always those, even Jesus, who are on the margins, out there encountering in the fringes, the edge of mystery, that eventually, once we appreciate what they have, that we slowly work in what they present to the world back into the center. And as Jesus says when he comes to his hometown, he says, you build statues for the prophets, but in their day, you murdered them, basically paraphrase. that we institutionalize it. And so it continually takes those who are on the margins. It continually takes us to pay attention and not to get into that groupthink and not to get into that majority think way of being as people. It takes us to continually challenge ourselves to resist that if we want to hear and experience the mystery and the mystics. It continually means that we have to guard ourselves from bullying, from pushing people to the margins, from not hearing the voices of those in the fringes and on the edges and in the margins. And that is the challenge of encountering mystery, is that we must be willing to go from those places that are comfortable and safe, from beyond those walls and out of those doors that we build to feel comfortable and safe because we know it. And it continually takes us to go out of those walls, beyond those doors, to encounter on the margins and the fringes, to hear the voices that have been crying out there for so long, the voices of women, the voices of LGBTQ and two-spirit people, and the voices of those who are continually outcast, people of color and BIPOC, peoples of our world. It takes us to continually challenge ourselves to move beyond that comfortable place where everything is known and nothing scares us, to listen to voices like Hildegard. Now, Hildegard was a master because she knew that music was a universal language and could use that. And why I think she did gain some acceptance in the world, because she found a medium that could translate from the margins to the people who are in the middle and the center, the majority. But we also have within our call to remember that divine light shines bright in the margins as much as it may shine in where we're comfortable, maybe even more. How do we encounter mystery if we constantly shut doors and build walls along what only is safe or comfortable or known for us? We have to challenge ourselves to venture out into the margins and embrace those voices and listen to them. Not saying every outside voice is necessarily conveying truth to the world, but it is out in the margins, out in the fringes, where when we learn to listen and honor those voices, people like Hildegard, as the church has learned to honor and listen to the voices of women, I believe it has enriched the church immeasurably and hope it continues to do so. We enrich who we are by bringing those voices and listening to them, and in that we can find ways to experience the divine mystery in much more meaningful and powerful ways for our lives. Now, I admit that I grew up in Berkeley, and that makes me automatically on the fringe of a fringe city, and it was decades ago in the 90s, I believe, that they declared that October 11th was not Columbus Day, but Indigenous People Day. But the state of Oregon finally caught up to Berkeley and did that this year. And I was very happy to see that. Not to make a political statement, but to say that the voices of the Native Americans, the voices of the indigenous people of our nations, are ones that have been silenced and ignored for a long time. And they have such beautiful and rich ritual, and depending on, and it's not all one, because there's 400 or 500 tribes, so there's this rich array of dance and music and lore and myth and legends and creation stories and things that just help me embrace and understand the mystery of our existence in ways that I have appreciated as I've studied them. And so it's happy that perhaps we can embrace and learn that maybe bullying, the way of life even that natives and indigenous people enjoyed, of a simple, more symbiotic existence with nature, would have been a lot better for us to learn from a long time ago, as we learn about how climate change threatens us all. And perhaps there's more we can learn from those voices. And also very happy on the same day in October that, and for the month of October being one for LGBTQ, Two-Spirit, and IA plus people, and affirming them and knowing that their reality has been one where they've been pushed to the margins and outside. And those churches, hopefully like ours, who have chosen to try to affirm and atone for the way they have been treated and begin listening to the voices that have helped us learn to be more compassionate and understanding. 2 examples, but there's many more. To continually challenge ourselves, if we really want to experience mystery and understand the vastness of the divine, then we must be willing to open doors, to go beyond the walls we build, and explore who's out there in the margins. And maybe not take almost 1,000 years to venerate those voices to the point where they have authority, just as Hildegard's voice now has authority in the church. I hope that can be our movement and the way that we choose to be. Amen. We're going to sing, and you're welcome to stand. Come and seek the ways of wisdom.
Please be seated, if you stood. I invite you to, if you haven't already, put your feet flat on the floor if you would like. This is always optional. Your invitation maybe to take a different prayer position, maybe hands to heart center, or maybe your palms resting gently on your thighs. This is so your body can be relaxed and grounded. You can softly close your eyes or gaze at something down and in front of you. And as we begin by noticing our breath, the miracle of life. We are told that God breathed God's breath within us at creation. And just check in for a moment to see if there's any place in your body that is tense, probably maybe shoulders or jaw. This is an invitation to feel safe, to feel held by our Creator's hands. We begin first, O God, with ourselves. Made in your image, we are told. As we breathe our breath into our nose and our lungs, maybe even fuller into our rib cage and our bellies, may we breathe deeply of your light and your love. This love shown us through Christ, through the dying of fall leaves and the promise of spring to come. Your light and love is around us, but it is deep within us. And so for a moment, give us grace to rest in our weaknesses, those places, those voices within us that scare us, that shame us, named and unnamed, known and unknown. And as we take a deep breath in, may we breathe in your grace. May we breathe in the head and heart knowledge that you are even there. And saying, "Oh, beloved child, I am here." And now perhaps we bring our attention to the voices within us that are never afraid to speak. Those places or parts of us with which we can breathe in confidence and courage as to who we are, those places that we sometimes forget and sometimes we rely on a bit too much for our worth. Those places that energize us in good ways for life. Those voices we cling to that make us hard to hear others. And even there we breathe in your grace. And now we cast our gaze a bit broader, O God, to those people in our lives whom we love fiercely, who we try to love, who we know we are invited to forgive when we can. And when we can't, we ask for your forgiveness to be. As we breathe in your love, and as we breathe out your grace for those whom we are close to. May your healing pervade the spaces within them, within us, and between us. And as we widen our gaze, O God, we see your world in pain. We hear voices that are angry and vengeful. We hear voices that are longing to be heard and to find their own safety and place of being held, not only by you, but by community. Forgive us and those who have gone before us for generations, who have forgotten that your very presence permeates every being, and indeed the planet upon which we live. May our mourning, our willingness to grieve, strengthen us to live in ways that honor you and the one whom you sent to us. May we trust in the greening of our very lives and the greening of this world, that your Spirit is still active and moving. May we wrestle with it. May we be challenged by it. May we be comforted. And together we say the prayer that your Son taught us. As we use words that reflect who we believe you to be, our Father or our Mother, our Creator, whatever fits. For you know the complexities of being your children and our longing to know you in deeper ways. Together we say, our Creator, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come. Thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, and the power, and the glory forever. Amen. I invite you to stand for our benediction and echo the words and the motions with me as you feel comfortable. Christ before us, Christ behind us, God above us, God beneath us, Spirit beside us, Spirit within us. And all God's people say amen. Amen. You're invited to sit for the postlude. We encourage you to leave through this door this way and to have your conversations out there.